Lady Eleanor Ashcombe had been raised to understand both the privileges and the perils of her station. As the eldest daughter of Sir Reginald Ashcombe, a baronet whose family name carried weight, though his fortune had grown thin, she had been trained from her earliest years to move with grace, to speak with care, and to think with discretion.
Her tutors had seen to her instruction in French and Italian. Her governess had instilled in her the refinements of music and watercolor painting, and her mother, before her untimely death, had impressed upon her the importance of composure in every circumstance. By the year 1837, Eleanor's position was precarious. The Ashcombe estate, though still respected, bore the visible signs of financial decline.
Her father, though dignified, could not disguise the strain of diminished revenues, and her younger brothers were not yet of age to contribute to the family's support. The responsibility of improving the family's standing, at least in part, rested upon Eleanor's shoulders. A suitable match could restore security, a poor one, or none at all, could hasten their decline. For this reason, Bath had become the stage upon which her future might be determined. Her aunt, Lady Rosalind Fairmont, a woman of keen judgment and unassailable reputation, had invited her to spend the season under her roof. Lady Rosalind, long widowed, commanded respect within society through her wit, her tact, and the independence she had cultivated since her husband's passing. Her house in Bath stood on one of the graceful crescents overlooking the city, and it was there that Eleanor found herself preparing for evenings at the pump room, afternoon promenades along the gravel walks, and the brilliant assemblies that defined the season. Eleanor's beauty did not announce itself loudly but drew notice all the same. Her figure was slender, her movements fluid, her complexion fair against the depth of her dark eyes. What set her apart, however, was her manner. She did not push herself forward, yet when she spoke, her words carried thoughtfulness beyond her years. She had learned to listen more than she spoke, and in so doing, revealed an intelligence that did not go unappreciated by those who conversed with her. In Bath, where many came to display themselves as though upon a stage, her quiet dignity was a rarity. It was at one of the earliest assemblies that Eleanor became the subject of particular interest. Marquis Henry Wycliffe, heir to one of the grandest titles in Somerset, was present that evening, standing somewhat apart from the throng. He was a man known less for easy charm than for reserve, his tall figure lending him a distinction that needed no embellishment. His reputation in Bath was one of gravity, tempered by courtesy but seldom softened by gaiety. Yet his attention appeared to settle upon Eleanor. He observed her during a set of dances, noted her conversation with a friend of her aunt's, and though he did not immediately approach, those who noticed his gaze began to whisper. The Marquis family was one of enduring influence, their estates stretching across Somerset with revenues that remained strong when others faltered. To imagine an alliance between such wealth and Eleanor's declining fortunes was natural for those who thrived on speculation. The baronet's daughter, with her refinement and dignity, would restore what her family lacked, while the Marquis would gain a wife of unblemished name and admirable character. Within days, the talk had spread across Bath, carried in subdued tones among ladies at their tea tables, and repeated with knowing looks in the pump room. For Eleanor, the Marquis's presence stirred feelings she did not readily admit. His manner was not one of overt gallantry, but in his silence there was a weight that seemed to anchor her own restless thoughts. When he did finally approach, it was not with extravagant compliment, but with a steady courtesy that made her feel, for the first time, truly seen rather than merely admired. In his presence, her confidence grew, though she kept her composure carefully guarded. Lady Rosalind, observant as ever, did not miss the change in her niece. One evening, after a walk along the Crescent, she remarked that the Marquis's attention was not the sort that passed without intention. Eleanor had blushed, though she replied with caution, reminding her aunt that attention was not the same as declaration. Lady Rosalind, however, allowed a small smile and said no more, content to watch as events unfolded. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and the Marquis were seen together with greater frequency. At the pump room, he would join her conversation. At assemblies, he would request her hand for a dance. During a promenade, his pace would adjust to hers. He did not speak of affection, but his consistent presence gave rise to belief among many that a proposal would not be long delayed. For Eleanor, hope began to bloom, cautious but undeniable. She allowed herself to imagine that perhaps her heart and her duty might, by fortune's grace, be united in one man. The gossip in Bath became almost a certainty. The Ashcombe family's diminished means would be countered by the Marquis's wealth. Eleanor's dignity and refinement would complement his reserve. Together, they would represent an alliance not only of fortune, but of character. To many, the match seemed inevitable, though nothing had yet been spoken aloud. As the season pressed on, anticipation grew for the grand assembly at the Guildhall. It was to be the crowning event, attended by Bath's most prominent families and guests of influence from beyond the city. Rumour swirled that the Marquis might choose that very evening to make his intentions known. Eleanor, though she kept her outward composure, could not prevent her heart from quickening at the thought. The gown she selected for the occasion was one of pale ivory silk, chosen with care, not for ostentation, but for quiet elegance. Lady Rosalind oversaw every detail of her niece's preparation, offering encouragement while maintaining a measured reserve. She knew too well the ways of society and the dangers of expectation. Yet even she, seasoned as she was, could not wholly conceal the light of possibility in her eyes. Eleanor, standing before the mirror as the final touches were arranged, allowed herself one silent breath of hope. Perhaps the evening would bring the fulfillment of her heart's quiet longing, the promise of a future secured not only by duty, but by love. But as the carriages prepared to depart for the Guildhall, beneath the glitter of lamps and the stir of anticipation, none could foresee how swiftly hope would be tested, nor how cruelly the night would alter the course of Eleanor's life. The Guildhall stood alight, every window blazing with candle flame, the tall arched doors open to admit Bath's most distinguished families. The great hall, with its high ceiling and polished floor, was filled with sound and movement. A string quartet played in the gallery above, their notes carrying across the crowd, weaving in and out of conversations and laughter. The scent of beeswax polish and perfume hung in the air, mingling with the rustle of silk gowns and the measured tread of polished boots. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe entered at her aunt's side, her ivory silk gown catching the glow of the chandeliers. Her aunt, Lady Rosalind, guided her forward with a practiced composure that steadied her steps, though Eleanor's heart beat faster with each passing moment. The crowd seemed to open as she crossed the threshold, and more than a few eyes turned toward her. She knew what they expected to see, the young lady whose name had been paired again and again in whispers with that of Marquis Henry Wycliffe. The Marquis was already present, standing near one of the tall columns at the edge of the hall. His dark coat, cut to perfection, emphasized his height and his bearing, his figure distinct even amid the throng. He acknowledged Eleanor with a small inclination of his head, his expression grave, as though weighed by thoughts not shared. Eleanor returned his greeting with equal restraint, though a warmth rose in her cheeks despite her efforts to remain composed. The music swelled, and couples moved gracefully into a country dance. Eleanor declined the first invitation offered her, waiting. When the Marquis at last approached, he requested her hand with a formality that concealed any inner sentiment. She accepted, her fingers light upon his arm, and together they joined the figures weaving across the floor. As they moved through the steps, Eleanor felt the eyes of the assembly upon them. Whispers stirred at the edges of the hall, speculation quickening with every turn of the dance. Though she concentrated upon the music and the measures, her awareness of the Marquis's presence never faltered. His gaze, steady yet unreadable, seemed fixed beyond the room, though his hand guided hers with faultless precision. When the dance concluded, he led her back to her place. Around them, voices lowered to murmurs, then rose again, charged with anticipation. It was not merely curiosity that filled the air, but expectation, as though the crowd itself awaited a declaration to be made. Lady Rosalind observed from her place nearby, her expression guarded. though her eyes never left her niece. The moments stretched. Conversations swelled, then faltered as attention shifted once more toward the Marquis. Several older gentlemen, acquaintances of his family, gathered close, their words half heard by those around them. Questions were raised, suggestions made with a smile or a pointed remark. The Marquis, pressed on every side by the weight of implication, stood silent at first, his jaw tight, his hand resting against the hilt of his cane. Then, in a voice clear enough to reach every corner of the hall, he spoke. His words fell like a sudden blade. "She means nothing to me." The effect was immediate and profound. The music ceased, bows suspended in mid-air, the notes unfinished. Conversation broke apart into silence. Faces turned sharply toward him, then toward Eleanor, whose stillness betrayed nothing of the storm that struck within. Her breath caught in her throat, but no sound escaped her lips. The company held its breath. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity sharpened to cruelty. A few exchanged knowing glances as though their suspicions had at last been confirmed. Eleanor felt the weight of every eye, the heat rising to her face, but she lifted her chin and met their stares with a composure she scarcely believed herself capable of holding. Lady Rosalind stepped forward at once, her hand upon her niece's arm, steadying her without words. The Marquis, meanwhile, remained rigid, his expression unmoved, though a faint shadow crossed his features, visible only to those who studied him closely. Whether it was triumph, regret, or torment, none could say. The whispers began again, first in hushed tones, then in ripples that spread across the assembly. "She presumed too much," murmured one lady, her fan fluttering before her lips. "He was never serious," replied another. The gentlemen, less restrained, exchanged quiet remarks about fortunes, alliances, and the dangers of ambition. Eleanor's pride held her upright. She would not give them the spectacle of tears, nor the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Her hands, though trembling faintly, remained still at her sides. Her gaze fixed ahead, unflinching, even as her heart throbbed painfully beneath her calm exterior. Lady Rosalind guided her toward the edge of the hall, her presence a shield against the crowd's curiosity. The Marquis did not move to stop her, nor did he speak again. He stood where he was, his silence as sharp as his words had been, while Eleanor passed from the glittering floor toward the doorway. And in that moment, though she gave no outward sign, Eleanor felt as though the very ground beneath her had been cut away, leaving her suspended before a descent she could not yet measure. The door to the Guildhall closed behind her, and with it the muffled swell of voices and music was shut away. Eleanor walked beside her aunt in silence, her steps steady, though every muscle in her body strained to tremble. The carriage waited at the curb, the lamps flickering in the night air. Lady Rosalind gave instructions to the driver in her calm, authoritative voice, then helped her niece into the seat. The horses started forward, hooves striking the cobblestones, the wheels echoing against the stone facades of Bath. Inside, the air was heavy. Eleanor sat straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the darkened street beyond the glass. She could still hear the Marquis's words, as if they had been carved into the silence itself. "She means nothing to me." Each repetition struck her like the toll of a bell, final and inescapable. Her cheeks burned with humiliation she would not show, not even to her aunt, whose presence was both comfort and reminder of the disgrace now surrounding her. When they reached Lady Rosalind's house on the Crescent, servants came to assist them, their eyes discreet but not without curiosity. Eleanor passed quickly through the hall and ascended to her chamber, her skirts brushing the polished wood. Once inside, she dismissed her maid with quiet firmness, desiring no witness to the weight that pressed upon her. Alone at last, she sank into the chair before her mirror, the candlelight revealing a pale reflection of the young woman who only hours before had dressed with hopeful anticipation. The ivory gown, once chosen with such care, now seemed a mockery. She untied the ribbons at her shoulders with unsteady hands, each loosened knot a reminder of the expectation that had been shattered. Her hair, still perfectly arranged, felt heavy, as though it belonged to someone else. She stared at her reflection until her vision blurred, but no tears fell. Pride held them back, pride and a determination that she would not allow even her mirror to see her undone. The hours stretched on. The city outside quieted, the last carriages rolling away from the assemblies, the lamps extinguished one by one along the street. Eleanor remained seated, her hands clenched tightly together, her thoughts consumed by the memory of the hall. She had entered that room believing herself respected, perhaps even cherished. She had left it discarded, her dignity surviving only in the firmness of her bearing. The morning brought no relief. When Eleanor entered the breakfast room, her aunt looked at her with a mixture of concern and restraint, offering no mention of the night before. The silence was itself a kindness, yet Eleanor could not avoid the knowledge of what the city now whispered. Already, Bath's society thrived upon her humiliation. Later that day, when she accompanied Lady Rosalind to the pump room, the truth became inescapable. Conversations hushed as they entered, fans lifted, eyes darted quickly toward them and then away. Acquaintances who had greeted Eleanor warmly only days before now offered stiff nods or avoided her entirely. Some ladies, feigning interest in the water or the marble columns, glanced sideways at her with barely concealed curiosity. Every whisper seemed to carry her name. The story of the Guildhall had spread with the speed of wildfire, repeated from one gathering to the next. She had presumed upon the Marquis's attention, they said. She had believed herself destined for a title that was never hers to claim. The humiliation was hers alone, for he had made himself clear before all. Even those who had once courted her conversation now kept their distance. A young lady with whom she had shared afternoons of music excused herself quickly after a strained greeting. An older matron, once eager to consult her upon matters of taste, turned away to examine a vase of flowers rather than meet her eyes. Eleanor bore it all with composure, her back straight, her steps measured, her voice calm when spoken to. But within, her spirit recoiled. That evening, she remained in her chamber once more. She walked the length of the carpet, her gown whispering with each turn, her hands clasped tightly together. The whispers of society reached her even here, carried by the faintest hints from the servants and the unspoken tension in her aunt's household. Eleanor pressed her hand against her breast as though to steady the storm within. Was love merely an illusion she had created for herself? Had every look, every gesture from the Marquis been only a shadow, misinterpreted by her eager heart? She replayed their every meeting in her mind, his gaze fixed upon her during a dance, his quiet words upon a promenade, his constancy in seeking her company, and wondered if she had been deceived by what she wished to see. The cruelty of his denial left her no answer but shame. Her pride prevented her from speaking of it, even to Lady Rosalind. Words would give shape to the humiliation she wished only to bury. She chose silence, though the silence itself weighed upon her as heavily as the Marquis's words. Night fell once more, the city quieting beyond the window panes, and Eleanor sank into a chair by the hearth, her eyes fixed upon the fading embers. And while she sat alone, holding back the tears that threatened but never fell, the Marquis in his own chamber pressed his hands against his brow, consumed by a torment he dared not reveal. The garden lay in stillness, the morning mist drifting low over the clipped hedges and gravel paths. Eleanor stepped into the air with measured tread, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. The previous days had been marked by silence and retreat, her heart still bruised from the blow delivered in Bath's grand hall. Yet her aunt had summoned her here with gentle insistence, refusing to allow her to wither within her chamber. Lady Rosalind waited near the rose arbors, her figure upright, her expression composed but touched with something Eleanor had come to recognize as resolve. When Eleanor approached, her aunt studied her with sharp eyes that softened only after a pause. Without ceremony, Lady Rosalind began to speak. Her voice was calm, but beneath its surface lay a current of steel. She reminded Eleanor that humiliation, however cruel, was not the measure of a woman's worth. The opinions of society shifted like the wind, but character, the quiet strength one carried within, was beyond the reach of gossip. Lady Rosalind recounted how women of their family had endured disgrace, bereavement, and betrayal, yet had risen with dignity intact. The lesson was clear. Eleanor must not allow a man's words, spoken in fear or arrogance, to define the course of her life. Eleanor listened, her eyes fixed upon the gravel at her feet, her breath slow and uneven. Her aunt's words pierced through the heaviness that had weighed upon her since the night of the assembly. For the first time, she considered that her shame need not be permanent, that she might carry herself beyond the confines of the gossip that now surrounded her. Lady Rosalind, seeing the flicker of recognition, pressed further. She urged her niece to abandon Bath for a time, to cease granting the city's tongues fresh material for speculation. Beyond its walls lay air untainted by whispers, hills unshadowed by scandal. There Eleanor might gather strength away from the eyes that sought to judge her. The suggestion at first struck Eleanor as an admission of defeat, a retreat from the field of battle. Yet as her aunt's voice wove through the quiet morning, she felt the notion shift within her mind. To leave Bath was not to surrender, but to preserve. Pride could not thrive beneath the constant gaze of those who delighted in her downfall. It required distance, a place where her wounds could begin to mend unseen. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to her aunt's, and in her eyes there was the first glimmer of acceptance. Plans were soon set in motion. Sir Reginald, though reluctant, acknowledged that Bath offered his daughter no comfort in her present state. Lady Rosalind, with her accustomed decisiveness, oversaw the arrangements, instructing servants to prepare for the journey to her country estate. Eleanor herself moved quietly through the halls, gathering her belongings with calm precision. She avoided the drawing rooms where she might encounter familiar faces, limiting herself to her chamber and the garden until the hour of departure. The day of leaving arrived. The carriage was drawn up before the house, trunks already secured, the horses restless in their harnesses. Eleanor descended the steps with her aunt beside her, her gown simple, her bonnet shading her face. The crescent was busy with passers-by, and she could feel their glances upon her even here. She held her head high, determined to grant them no satisfaction. As she stepped into the carriage, Eleanor allowed herself one final look at the city. The familiar streets, the polished windows of the pump room, the grand facades of the assembly rooms, all were touched now with the bitterness of memory. Yet beneath that bitterness lay the faintest stirrings of relief, for she knew she would not be compelled to endure them again, at least for a season. The coachman cracked his whip, and the carriage began its descent along the curved street. Eleanor sat back against the cushions, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed ahead. She could not yet imagine what awaited her beyond Bath, nor how the course of her life might shift in the quiet hills of Somerset. She knew only that she was leaving behind the place where her pride had been wounded most deeply, uncertain whether her departure marked an escape or a surrender. The road into Somerset wound through gentle valleys and hills, scattered with sheep, the carriage wheels carrying Eleanor farther from the city that had become a prison of whispers. Hours passed in silence, Lady Rosalind resting with practiced composure beside her, while Eleanor gazed through the window at fields that glistened under the late summer sun. The countryside stretched endlessly, green and open, free of the heavy air of suspicion that clung to Bath. The rhythm of hooves and wheels steadied her thoughts, though the memory of her humiliation followed like a shadow she could not yet cast off. When at last the carriage drew near Lady Rosalind's estate, the gates opened upon a modest but dignified property. The house was of grey stone softened by ivy, its windows looking out upon lawns bordered by old trees. It was not grand like the manors Eleanor had visited during past seasons, but its simplicity carried a kind of peace that grandeur could not provide. As she stepped down from the carriage, she inhaled the quiet air, touched with the scent of late roses and damp earth. For the first time since the night at the Guildhall, her chest felt less heavy. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm unlike the hurried pace of Bath. Mornings began with walks along the gravel paths, the mist clinging to the hedges before lifting to reveal hills stretching beyond. Eleanor wandered through the gardens, finding solace in the ordered beds of flowers and the soft murmur of water from a stone fountain. Indoors, she turned to music, her hands upon the pianoforte keys not for performance but for her own comfort. Books that had gathered dust on Lady Rosalind's shelves were opened once more, their pages a refuge. The quiet of the estate gave her space to breathe, though her thoughts, when left unguarded, still circled back to the Marquis and the words that had undone her. It was during one of her walks beyond the garden wall that Eleanor first encountered Lord Edmund Harrow. He came upon the path leading from the neighbouring estate, his stride unhurried, his figure tall, though without the commanding presence she had grown accustomed to in Bath. He carried a walking stick more for habit than necessity, and his manner, when he paused to greet Lady Rosalind and her niece, was marked by attentiveness rather than display. His voice was low, his words measured, his bow respectful. Introductions revealed him to be a man of moderate fortune, his lands lying not far from Lady Rosalind's. Unlike the Marquis, he did not speak with the weight of long-held influence, but with the steady assurance of one whose life was tied to the soil and the tenants who depended upon him. He did not linger long that first morning, only offering the courtesies due before resuming his walk. Yet Eleanor found herself considering the encounter afterward with a faint curiosity. In the days that followed, chance meetings became more frequent. On a morning when Eleanor and her aunt visited the churchyard, Lord Edmund was there, examining the restoration of an ancient stone. Another afternoon, as she read beneath the oak trees, he passed by on horseback, slowing to exchange polite remarks before continuing on his way. Each encounter was brief, but each left behind an impression that deepened gradually. What distinguished him was his manner of listening. When Eleanor spoke, whether of the gardens, of books, or of the landscape before them, he attended with a focus that suggested her words were of genuine value. He did not interrupt, nor seek to impress her with his own knowledge, but allowed her voice to shape the conversation. That small courtesy, so rare among the polished exchanges of Bath, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. The hours spent in his company were unremarkable to any observer, yet within them she felt the faint stirrings of renewal. A walk along the riverbank revealed his appreciation for poetry, and when he recited a line from Milton, his tone carried no pretension, only quiet admiration. Another day, a sudden summer rain forced them to take shelter beneath an arbor, and as droplets fell around them, Eleanor laughed softly at the absurdity of their damp attire. It was the first time she had laughed since leaving Bath, and the sound surprised even herself. Each small moment began to weave itself into the fabric of her days. Though she carried still the wound of rejection, she no longer felt wholly defined by it. In Edmund's presence, she sensed no judgment, no speculation, only recognition of her mind and spirit. Yet she guarded her heart carefully, wary of allowing hope to rise again too swiftly. The estate's peace deepened with the passing weeks. Lady Rosalind, observing the quiet transformation in her niece, offered no comment, only ensuring that Eleanor had every opportunity for rest and reflection. The rhythm of rural life, the turning of the fields, the calls of shepherds in the distance, all reminded her that existence could continue beyond the confines of scandal. Still, the past lingered. Each night, as Eleanor closed her eyes, she saw once more the Marquis standing before the assembly, his words slicing through the silence, the crowd's eyes upon her. Though Edmund's attentions began to steady her heart, she knew that her story with Henry Wycliffe had not ended in Bath. Somewhere, beyond the quiet hills, the world of society moved on, and with it the man who had cast her aside. And it was in this fragile balance, between the healing touch of new acquaintance and the unhealed wound of betrayal, that Eleanor soon found herself face to face once more with the shadow she had sought to leave behind. The village fete was held upon the grounds of a local manor, its wide lawn decorated with banners that fluttered in the warm breeze. Tables had been arranged with refreshments. Musicians played beneath a canvas awning, and families from the surrounding countryside mingled with visiting gentry. Eleanor arrived with her aunt. Her gown simple but tastefully chosen, the pale blue fabric reflecting the clear sky above. She carried herself with composure, her steps light upon the grass, her expression serene. The air held the scent of fresh hay from nearby fields, and children's laughter carried from the edge of the green where games were set in motion. For a time, Eleanor moved freely among the gathering. Neighbors greeted her with warmth, their words unmarked by the sharp edge of gossip she had endured in Bath. She conversed with a vicar's wife about the produce of the season, listened to the music drifting across the lawn, and allowed herself the faint ease of belonging without scrutiny. Lord Edmund was also present, attending quietly to those he knew, his manner consistent with the steady gentleness Eleanor had come to appreciate. Their exchanges were unhurried, free of expectation, and brought her a quiet comfort. Yet even amid the calm of the fete, a shift came without warning. A murmur passed through the crowd, a ripple of voices that drew heads to turn. Eleanor, following their gaze, saw him. The Marquis of Wycliffe had arrived. His presence was unmistakable, his tall figure set apart by the precision of his attire and the gravity of his bearing. Though this was no assembly of Bath, his entrance carried with it the same effect, the immediate stir of attention, the whispered remarks, the sharp pull of eyes toward him. Eleanor's breath caught, though she quickly steadied it. She had not expected to encounter him here, upon ground that had come to feel removed from the society that had wounded her. Yet there he was, his eyes scanning the lawn until they found hers. The distance between them seemed suddenly to vanish, though she stood rooted in place, her hand resting lightly upon the edge of a table to still its faint tremor. He moved toward her with unhurried steps, each measured with purpose. The crowd seemed to give way, though not without lingering glances. Whispers arose once more, questions revived, speculations sharpened. Eleanor remained as she was, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. The composure she had gained in Somerset held her steady, though her heart beat heavily beneath her bodice. When at last he reached her, the silence of those nearest was palpable. The Marquis inclined his head, his eyes fixed upon her with a depth of feeling that belied the calm of his features. Eleanor, with equal control, returned his greeting. Her voice was steady, carrying no tremor, her manner unmarked by the humiliation he had once forced upon her. To those who observed, she appeared untouched, her dignity preserved in every line of her bearing. The Marquis faltered, though only slightly, as though unprepared for her unshaken composure. He lingered a moment longer, but words seemed to fail him. The crowd, eager for drama, waited in vain for a scene to unfold. Eleanor, granting them none, turned away with quiet poise, her attention directed to her aunt and to Lord Edmund, who had approached with courtesy. Together they moved toward another part of the fete, leaving the Marquis standing solitary among the murmurs. Around them, the whispers revived with new force. Some marveled at Eleanor's dignity, others speculated at the meaning of the Marquis's presence. Was he here by design, drawn once more to the woman he had dismissed, or was it mere chance that had placed them upon the same green? The question stirred through the crowd, feeding the restless curiosity that no music or diversion could entirely still. Eleanor, though outwardly composed, felt the weight of that encounter settle within her. She had faced him at last, not as the humiliated girl of Bath, but as a woman who had regained her strength. Yet the steadiness of her voice, the calm of her bearing, had cost her dearly, for beneath them her heart still trembled with unspoken pain. And as the fete continued, the Marquis's gaze followed her from afar, his silence betraying to those who observed that his heart was no longer untouched, though none could yet name the struggle that bound him. The days that followed the fete were marked by unease, though outwardly life in the countryside appeared unchanged. The harvest neared, farmers moved steadily through the fields, and the air was filled with the hum of late summer. Yet beneath the calm surface, the presence of the Marquis at the gathering lingered in every conversation. Neighbors who had once spoken only of crops and weather now wove his name into their remarks. their curiosity sharpened by the sudden reappearance of a figure who had once brought Eleanor so much disgrace. In drawing rooms and along garden walks, the talk persisted. Some wondered aloud if the Marquis intended to undo the cruelty of his earlier words. Others claimed he was bound for an advantageous marriage elsewhere, and his attendance at the fête had been no more than a passing courtesy. The uncertainty was more wounding than certainty could ever have been, for speculation held Eleanor once more at the mercy of society's restless tongues. Her composure had been admired on the day itself, but admiration quickly transformed into renewed scrutiny. For Eleanor, the return of whispers carried a familiar sting. She had begun to breathe more freely in the quiet of Somerset, only to find the weight of gossip pressing upon her again. Though she walked the gardens with calm dignity, the knowledge that her name was once more entwined with the Marquis's unsettled her peace. Even Lord Edmund's steady presence could not wholly shield her. He accompanied her on walks, listened with patience when she spoke of books or music, and treated her with the unbroken courtesy that marked his character. Yet even he could not silence the voices of neighbours who speculated upon matters no one but Eleanor and the Marquis could truly know. The Marquis himself was not absent from this turmoil. In his family's house, he faced pressures greater than mere rumour. His relatives, intent upon strengthening their influence, pressed him with growing urgency toward an engagement with an heiress whose wealth and connections promised advantage. Letters were written, discussions conducted, all with the assumption that Henry Wycliffe would soon consent. To resist was to invite censure, to weaken his family's position, to betray the expectations that had shaped his life since youth. Yet to consent was to bind himself to a future from which his heart recoiled. The conflict grew daily within him. The memory of Eleanor at the fête, her composure, her dignity, the calm defiance of her bearing, unsettled him more than her tears would have done. She had stood before him not as a woman broken by humiliation, but as one who had claimed her strength anew. The sight had pierced him, for it revealed what he had cast aside, and it forced upon him the knowledge that she might yet turn her heart elsewhere. And indeed, society now whispered of such a possibility. Lord Edmund's attentions, quiet and honourable, had not gone unnoticed. He was no man of ostentation, but his sincerity was plain to all who observed him. The contrast between his constancy and the Marquis's cold dismissal at Bath was not lost upon those eager to pass judgment. More than one tongue suggested that Eleanor would be wise to accept the steadiness of Edmund's devotion, leaving behind forever the man who had wounded her. Eleanor heard these whispers, though none dared voice them to her directly. She bore them with the same composure she had learned to wear as armor, yet within her the conflict deepened. She could not forget the Marquis, however cruel his words had been. Yet she could not ignore the respect and kindness of Edmund, who asked nothing of her but sincerity. Each day, as she moved through the quiet rooms of her aunt's house, the weight of choice pressed upon her, though no choice had yet been demanded. The Marquis, caught between duty and longing, felt the chains of expectation tightening. His family's counsel grew firmer, their displeasure mounting at his hesitation. The heiress was ready, the match approved, the arrangements poised to be sealed. Yet still he delayed, consumed by the memory of Eleanor and the silence that had already cost him dearly. Every day of inaction threatened to condemn him to a future he did not desire, even as every day of silence risked losing her forever. And so, while the countryside carried on with its harvest, and the village bells marked the passing of each untroubled hour, Eleanor and the Marquis stood upon paths that would soon converge once more, drawn together by a reckoning neither could postpone. The air in Somerset had begun to cool with the first signs of autumn. Leaves along the edges of the estate's grounds turned from green to gold, and the days shortened into evenings marked by long shadows across the lawns. Eleanor moved through these hours with a quiet steadiness, though within her there was a constant undercurrent of thought she could not still. It was during such a season of reflection that Lord Edmund, after weeks of gentle attentions, sought a moment alone with her. They walked along the garden paths, the gravel crunching beneath their steps, the roses fading, but still fragrant in the late sunlight. Edmund's voice, though calm, carried a weight that Eleanor recognized at once. He spoke not with hesitation, but with the firmness of a man whose feelings had long since been settled. With sincerity, he confessed that his admiration for her had grown from respect into something deeper. He valued her dignity, her strength, her kindness, qualities he had observed in every moment of their acquaintance. He wished, he said, to devote his life to her happiness. The words, though not unexpected, pierced Eleanor with a sudden intensity. Edmund's manner was free of pretense. He offered no flattery, no show of grandeur, only the constancy of his devotion. He asked for her hand not as a prize, but as a choice she alone must make. When his voice fell silent, the garden seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of leaves the only sound between them. Eleanor, her heart touched by the honesty before her, could not answer at once. She thanked him with quiet grace, asking for time, her voice trembling despite her composed bearing. Edmund inclined his head with respect, accepting her wish without complaint. That evening Eleanor withdrew to her chamber, her thoughts divided. Edmund's words had awakened in her both gratitude and conflict. His devotion was unquestionable, and she knew that life with him would be marked by steadiness and peace. Yet the shadow of the past had not been erased. The Marquis's presence still lingered in her heart, though she had sought to banish it. His silence, his coldness, his rejection, these should have ended her feelings. Yet she could not deny that they remained. It was in this state of restless reflection that fate intervened. On the following afternoon, Eleanor entered the old rose garden at the far end of the estate, seeking solitude among the last blooms of the season. The sky was veiled with grey clouds, and the air carried the cool dampness of approaching rain. As she turned along the path, she saw him. The Marquis stood there, his dark figure set against the pale blossoms, his expression strained, his eyes fixed upon her with a desperation she had never before seen in him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The garden lay hushed, the branches stirring faintly in the wind. Then he stepped forward, his voice breaking the stillness. Gone was the coldness that had once cut her so cruelly. In its place was raw, unguarded emotion. He confessed that the words spoken in Bath had been false, born not of truth but of fear. Duty, expectation, the crushing weight of family ambition, these had bound him, had driven him to deny the very thing that burned within him. Yet, in denying her, he had denied himself, and the torment of it had not ceased since. Eleanor's heart throbbed painfully at his words. She stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly before her, listening as he laid bare the struggle he had long concealed. He spoke of nights without rest, of the image of her that haunted him still, of the knowledge that his silence might soon cost him forever what he could not live without. Each word fell with the weight of confession, heavy with regret, urgent with longing. Tears threatened to rise, but Eleanor held them back. She did not move toward him, nor offer him the comfort of forgiveness. She listened, her face pale but steady, her breath caught between disbelief and aching recognition. The Marquis, once the picture of reserve, now stood before her undone, pleading not with arrogance, but with humility. And in that moment, Eleanor felt the full measure of her conflict. Edmund's devotion, constant and true, waited quietly for her answer. The Marquis's love, fierce and broken, now stood revealed in desperation. Before her lay two paths, the safety of peace or the risk of passion, the certainty of constancy or the hope of redemption. The garden held its silence as Eleanor realized that the choice now rested entirely with her, and that whatever she chose would shape the course of her life forever. The choice did not come swiftly, nor without weight. After the Marquis's confession in the rose garden, Eleanor withdrew into silence. She walked the length of the gravel paths until dusk, her gown brushed by the fading flowers, her mind torn between two futures. The air grew colder, and a fine mist began to fall, yet she scarcely noticed. Every word spoken by Lord Edmund returned to her with its calm strength, while every plea uttered by the Marquis rang with desperate truth. Both voices lived within her, and she felt torn as though by opposing tides. That night she did not sleep. She sat beside her window, the candle guttering low, her eyes fixed upon the dark fields beyond. Memories came unbidden, the Marquis guiding her through a dance in Bath, the sting of his dismissal, the whispers that followed, and then the sight of him in Somerset, undone and pleading for forgiveness. Then, too, she remembered Edmund, his steady gaze, his patience, the gentleness with which he had sought her happiness above his own. In her heart there was no easy answer, but she knew that silence could no longer preserve her. A decision must be made, and she alone could make it. At dawn she descended to the garden, the air crisp, the grass wet with dew. Lady Rosalind found her there, pale but composed, her face marked by the clarity of one who has resolved an inner battle. She spoke little, but her aunt understood. Eleanor would not allow fear to dictate her life. If she chose wrongly, it would be her error, but it would be her choice, made freely, not pressed upon her by society, nor dictated by silence. When the Marquis came again, Eleanor received him with dignity. She listened as he renewed his plea, his words heavy with the weight of love long denied. Then, with a voice firm, though quiet, she gave her answer. She told him that she would accept him, but only upon the condition that he cast aside the silence and fear that had once cost them both so dearly. She would not live as the shadow of his ambition, nor permit herself to be silenced for the sake of duty. If he wished to claim her, it must be as his equal, his partner not only in affection, but in truth. The Marquis bowed his head, humbled. His reply was not clothed in grandeur, but in earnest promise. He swore that he would never again allow fear or duty to speak in place of his heart. In that moment, Eleanor saw in him not the man who had wounded her, but the man who had been broken by his own weakness and now sought redemption. Her choice, though not without pain, was made. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. Their union was not to be the grand event society had once imagined, but a ceremony of simplicity and truth. Lady Rosalind arranged for the small parish chapel to be opened, its stone walls covered in ivy, its interior lit by the soft glow of candles. There would be no throngs of curious guests, no ostentation, only those few whose presence marked love rather than spectacle. On the appointed day, Eleanor dressed not in the silks and jewels that Bath might have demanded, but in a gown of simple white muslin, her hair adorned with nothing more than a ribbon of pale satin. She walked with calm steps to the chapel, her aunt beside her, her heart steady, though her hands trembled slightly. When she entered, she saw the Marquis waiting, his expression stripped of pride, his eyes fixed upon her with reverence. The ceremony passed with quiet solemnity. The vows were spoken, the hands joined, the prayers offered, all without grandeur, but with a depth that touched all who bore witness. When the moment came to seal their union, Eleanor felt a sense of liberation as profound as it was tender. She had been cast down, humiliated before all of Bath, yet now she stood renewed, not as a woman conquered, but as one who had claimed her destiny. When they emerged from the chapel, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft light across the Somerset hills. The world around them seemed unchanged, the fields, the trees, the distant sound of shepherds calling to their flocks, yet for Eleanor, everything had been transformed. She was no longer bound by whispers or silenced by fear. She had chosen love, and in choosing, she had found her freedom. The morning after their quiet wedding dawned clear and calm, the Somerset hills touched with a pale gold light. Eleanor rose early, the air cool against her skin, and stepped into the garden with her shawl drawn close. The grass sparkled with dew, and the roses, though faded with the season, released a gentle fragrance when stirred by the breeze. The silence of the countryside was deep, broken only by the faint call of birds and the distant lowing of cattle. It was a silence that seemed to mirror the peace within her heart, a peace she had not known for many months. Henry joined her soon after, his figure tall in the early light, his expression softened by the humility that had marked him since the vows were spoken. There was no reserve now in his manner, no mask of duty or fear, only the quiet presence of a man who had at last allowed himself to be wholly known. He walked beside her without speaking at first, their steps aligned along the gravel path. When he did finally speak, his words were simple: that he was grateful, and that he would spend his life proving himself worthy of her forgiveness and her trust. Eleanor looked at him then, her dark eyes steady, and for the first time she allowed herself to smile without restraint. It was not the careful smile of society, nor the guarded composure she had worn in Bath, but a smile born of freedom. In that moment she knew she had chosen rightly, for what bound them now was not ambition or expectation, but truth. She reached for his hand, and he clasped hers with a tenderness that spoke more than any declaration. The days that followed unfolded gently, each one reinforcing the promise of their union. They walked together through the fields, the autumn wind lifting Eleanor's ribbons, the Marquis brushing fallen leaves from her path. They lingered in the small chapel where they had spoken their vows, sitting in silence before the altar, where candles had burned on their wedding day. They spoke of little things, the turning of the season, the books they wished to read, the music Eleanor played upon the pianoforte in the evenings, and in these small exchanges lay the foundation of a deeper happiness. At night, when the house grew quiet and the last candle had been extinguished, Eleanor would reflect upon the path that had led her here. She remembered the sharp sting of humiliation in Bath, the whispers that had followed her, the solitude of her chamber, where she had wondered if her life had been ruined beyond repair. She remembered the counsel of her aunt, the peace of the countryside, the steady kindness of Lord Edmund, and the torment that had driven Henry at last to confess what he had long concealed. Each memory formed a chain, leading her step by step to this moment of calm joy. The transformation within Henry was as plain to her as the change within herself. He no longer carried the rigid pride that had once marked his presence. Instead, his reserve had softened into something more open, more vulnerable. With her, he no longer sought to impress or command. He listened. He admitted his fears. He allowed his heart to speak without disguise. In his humility, Eleanor found the love she had once only dreamed might be possible. In the evenings, when the fire crackled in the hearth, Henry would sit beside her, his gaze fixed not upon the world beyond, but upon the woman beside him. He would speak of his past weakness without excuse, only with the promise that it would not govern their future. Eleanor, hearing these words, felt the last remnants of bitterness dissolve. She had been wounded, yes, but the wound had healed into strength, and that strength was now shared between them. Their marriage, though simple, was rich in meaning. It was not the union Bath society had anticipated, not a spectacle of fortune and ambition, but a bond forged in the crucible of trial and forgiveness. Those who had once whispered of scandal could no longer touch her. Eleanor had risen above their judgment, not by denying her pain, but by walking through it with dignity, until she emerged free. One afternoon, as they walked once more through the rose garden where Henry had first confessed his heart, Eleanor paused beside the faded blossoms. The petals, though withered, still clung to the stems, a reminder of beauty that endured even after its season had passed. She turned to Henry and told him that this garden, once a place of conflict, had become for her a place of renewal. It was here she had heard his truth, and it was here she had chosen to believe in it. He drew her hand to his lips, and for a long moment they stood together in silence, the autumn wind stirring the leaves around them. Eleanor's life had been altered not by society's approval, but by her own courage. She had faced humiliation, endured whispers, and resisted despair. She had listened to the voice of strength within her, and because of it, she had been able to choose love not as a duty, but as a freedom. Looking upon Henry now, she knew that this was the lesson her journey had given her, that the heart, when silenced by fear, can only wound itself, but when allowed to speak, can heal not only one soul, but two. And so, dear listener, this story speaks not only of a young woman and a marquis in the year 1837, but of all who have known fear, humiliation, or doubt. It tells us that courage is not the absence of pain, but the decision to rise after it. It reminds us that love cannot flourish in silence, but only in truth. And it shows us that dignity is not lost in rejection, but in surrendering one's own voice. Eleanor's journey from disgrace to liberation is not hers alone. It is the story of every heart that dares to believe that authenticity matters more than approval, and that true love, once chosen freely, is the greatest triumph of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment, telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.